Africa has long been a continent rich in resources, yet paradoxically, its wealth has often benefited foreign powers rather than its own people. The term neocolonialism is frequently used to describe this ongoing exploitation, where former colonial powers and other Western nations continue to exert economic and political control over African countries, despite the end of formal colonial rule. But the tides are shifting. African nations are beginning to rise against this modern-day colonialism, asserting their sovereignty and demanding control over their resources. This movement has been particularly visible in West Africa, where the presence of France, the former colonial ruler of many countries in the region, has been increasingly challenged. Take, for example, Burkina Faso. After enduring years of political instability, including two coups in recent years, the country has taken a significant step by banning gold exports to Western countries. This bold move is more than just a national policy change. It's a declaration of independence from the neocolonial grip that has held the continent in its clutches for far too long. The actions of Burkina Faso have sparked a wave of resistance across Africa, inspiring other nations to reconsider their own economic relationships with the West. Countries are beginning to stand up, one by one, saying enough to the relentless extraction of their wealth by foreign powers. This resistance is not just about economic control. It's about reclaiming the dignity and autonomy that was stripped away during the colonial era and continues to be undermined today. But here's where things get really interesting. While France has been the primary target of anti-colonial sentiment, it's not just the French feeling the heat. In fact, other Western nations, often overshadowed by the focus on France, are now finding themselves in the spotlight. These countries, which have long benefited from Africa's resources through trade agreements, investments, and influence over local governments, are now facing a pushback from African markets. So who are these nations? And why are they suddenly getting the boot from African economies? The answers to these questions reveal the complex and evolving dynamics of global power as African countries seek to break free from the chains of neocolonial exploitation. It's a story of resistance, resilience, and the fight for true independence, one that is unfolding across the continent with profound implications for the future of Africa and its relationship with the rest of the world. Burkina Faso, a small landlocked nation in West Africa, has recently made global headlines by challenging the deeply entrenched systems of neocolonial control. Under the unyielding leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the country has taken a bold step by suspending the export of gold from its artisanal and semi-mechanized mining operations. This move goes beyond the realm of economics. It is a powerful statement of sovereignty, self-determination, and the audacious reclaiming of a nation's wealth. For decades, countries like Burkina Faso have been treated as little more than resource banks by Western powers, their wealth extracted with little regard for the devastation left behind. Gold, one of the most coveted resources, has flowed out of Burkina Faso to enrich foreign interests, particularly in Europe, while the local population has suffered from the resulting instability and poverty. This exploitation has not only drained the country's wealth, but has also fueled terror and conflict, further entrenching the nation's challenges. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, another gold-rich nation, the story is eerily similar. The DRC is home to some of the world's purest gold. Yet the men who mine this precious metal endure extortion, rights abuses, and harsh conditions. While consumers in richer countries are willing to pay top dollar for the finished product, the miners themselves pay a steep price, both in terms of their well-being and their lives. The suspension of gold exports from Burkina Faso, particularly to nations like Switzerland, marks a significant shift in the balance of power. Switzerland, known for its global gold refining industry, has historically been a major destination for African gold. This development raises questions about the role of other Western nations, not just France, in the ongoing exploitation of Africa's resources. This decision by Burkina Faso is more than just an economic maneuver. It is a direct challenge to the status quo of Western control over African nations. It signals a new era where African countries are no longer content to be passive participants in their own exploitation. Instead, they are taking decisive actions to protect their resources, assert their sovereignty, and redefine their place in the global economy. Burkina Faso's emergence as a focal point in the ongoing struggle over Africa's natural resources is no coincidence. The nation's vast deposits of gold, which have made it Africa's fourth largest gold producer, have drawn the attention of foreign powers for centuries. Despite sitting on this treasure trove of mineral wealth, Burkina Faso has remained impoverished and destabilized, a situation that highlights the deep-rooted exploitation that has plagued the continent. Gold, while being a highly coveted precious metal, is also a critical driver of global economies. For resource-rich but development-challenged nations like Burkina Faso, gold mining plays a vital role in generating state revenue. However, the wealth generated from this resource has historically been siphoned off by foreign corporations and governments, often in collusion with a small elite within the country. This has left the majority of the population mired in poverty, with little to show for the immense natural wealth beneath their feet. Recognizing this long-standing exploitation, the military junta in Burkina Faso, led by Captain Ibrahim Traoré, has taken bold steps to address the issue. By suspending the export of artisanal and semi-mechanized gold, the junta is effectively cutting off a significant source of the legal revenue that has long fueled shadowy networks both within and outside the country. This decision is not merely about protecting the nation's wealth. It represents a broader assertion of control over Burkina Faso's future. The journey to this point has been marked by increasing resistance to the neocolonial practices that have kept Burkina Faso and other African nations in a cycle of dependency and exploitation. As the country stands at this critical juncture, the question arises, how did Burkina Faso reach a point where it felt compelled to take such decisive action? African nations like Burkina Faso have long grappled with the lingering economic chains of neocolonialism, where the exploitative structures established during colonial rule persist in more subtle yet equally destructive forms. Western corporations, often backed by their governments, have continued to extract Africa's vast resources at a fraction of their true value, utilizing corrupt practices, legal loopholes, and sheer economic dominance. This ongoing extraction has led to a significant transfer of wealth from Africa to the West, leaving the continent with little benefit from its abundant natural resources. In Burkina Faso, this exploitation has been exacerbated by the involvement of armed groups that have profited from illegal gold mining to fund their activities. These groups have flourished in the chaos, fueled by weak governance and external interference, transforming parts of the country into lawless zones where the rule of law has been supplanted by the rule of the gun. The military junta's recent decision to suspend gold exports is a direct response to this crisis. It represents an attempt to restore order to a sector rife with corruption, violence, and exploitation. By taking control of the gold trade, the junta is not only attempting to stabilize the country, but also asserting its authority over Burkina Faso's future. The aim is to ensure that the nation's resources are utilized for the benefit of its people, rather than being siphoned off by foreign powers and their local collaborators. However, this move marks only the beginning of a larger struggle. The West, deeply entrenched in Africa's resource wealth, is unlikely to relinquish its grip without resistance. The suspension of gold exports is a significant first step in a broader strategy aimed at reclaiming Africa's resources and redirecting them to benefit those who reside on the continent. But what fuels the West's insatiable appetite for African gold? The answer lies in a complex mix of control, power, and economic dominance. For centuries, Western powers have sought to maintain control over Africa's vast resources through a combination of economic pressure, political manipulation, and, when deemed necessary, military force. Gold, beyond its status as a precious metal, symbolizes power, wealth, and control. By controlling the flow of gold out of Africa, Western nations have sustained their dominance on the global stage. Gold has always played a crucial role in the global economy, serving as a store of value, a hedge against inflation, and a symbol of wealth and power. For Western nations, access to African gold has been instrumental in maintaining their economic and political dominance, with the precious metal flowing steadily into the vaults of Western banks. The exploitation of Burkina Faso's gold reserves is a glaring example of how Western involvement in Africa's resource trade has left nations impoverished while enriching foreign powers. For years, reports have surfaced detailing how illegal gold exports, often facilitated by corrupt officials and foreign corporations, have funneled this precious resource out of the country. The gold, once extracted from Burkina Faso's mines, is laundered through various channels before ending up in the vaults of Western banks and corporations, far from the reach of the people who should be its rightful beneficiaries. The military junta's bold decision to suspend gold exports is a direct and audacious challenge to this entrenched system of exploitation. It's a clear message that Burkina Faso will no longer stand by as its wealth is siphoned off by foreign interests. However, this move is fraught with risks. The West, particularly countries with a long history of colonial exploitation in Africa, is unlikely to remain passive. These nations are expected to respond with a mix of economic and political pressure, aiming to undermine the junta's efforts and restore the status quo. To fully grasp why the West is so determined to maintain control over Africa's resources, it's essential to consider the broader geopolitical context. The global economy has become increasingly competitive, with emerging powers like China and India challenging the long-standing dominance of Western nations. In this fiercely competitive landscape, control over resources like gold is viewed as a strategic necessity for maintaining economic and political power. For Western nations, access to African resources goes beyond mere economic gain. It's about preserving their position in the global hierarchy. Gold, with its deep ties to financial stability and wealth, plays a crucial role in this dynamic. By controlling the flow of gold from Africa, Western countries have been able to sustain their dominance, using the wealth generated from these resources to fuel their economies. Meanwhile, the nations from which these resources are extracted, like Burkina Faso, have been left struggling, unable to fully benefit from their own natural wealth. The suspension of gold exports in Burkina Faso, therefore, represents more than just a national policy shift. It's a defiant stand against a global system that has historically prioritized the interests of the powerful over the rights and prosperity of the vulnerable. But this is just the beginning of what could be a long and arduous battle, as the forces of neocolonialism are unlikely to give up their grip on Africa's wealth without a fight. The exploitation of Africa's resources has long been a cornerstone of Western power, and they are unlikely to relinquish their grip without resistance. However, the military junta in Burkina Faso is standing firm, understanding that the issue extends beyond mere gold. It's about reclaiming control over the country's future. By cutting off the flow of gold to the west, Burkina Faso is challenging the entire neocolonial system that has kept Africa in a state of perpetual underdevelopment. This bold move could have far-reaching implications for the entire continent. The critical question now is how the West will respond. Will they attempt to undermine the junta's efforts through economic sanctions, political pressure, or even covert actions? Or will they acknowledge that the global landscape is shifting and that Africa is no longer willing to be a passive participant in its exploitation? The stakes are incredibly high, and the outcome of this struggle will have profound implications for the future of Africa and the global order. One of the most powerful tools the West has used to maintain its control over Africa is the manipulation of narratives. For decades, Western media and politicians have portrayed Africa as a continent plagued by corruption, violence, and poverty. This narrative serves to justify the continued exploitation of Africa's resources while deflecting attention from the role that Western powers play in perpetuating these problems. The portrayal of Africa as a continent in perpetual crisis is not merely a reflection of reality. It is a carefully constructed narrative designed to serve the interests of the West. By focusing on the negative aspects of life in Africa, Western media creates a sense of hopelessness and inevitability, suggesting that the continent is incapable of managing its affairs without outside intervention. This narrative is often reinforced by politicians like Giorgia Meloni, who in 2019 claimed that 50% of everything Burkina Faso exports ends up in the French treasury. This statement, while attention-grabbing, is entirely false. World Bank data reveals that France is not even among the top 5 destinations for Burkina Faso's exports. In fact, nearly 90% of Burkina Faso's gold is exported to Switzerland, not France. This manipulation of narratives has been a powerful tool in maintaining Western dominance over Africa, but it is being increasingly challenged as African nations like Burkina Faso assert their sovereignty and seek to reclaim control over their resources. The battle for Africa's future is not just being fought in the mines and fields of the continent, but also in the media and political arenas where the story of Africa is being told and retold. This kind of misinformation is not accidental. It is part of a deliberate strategy to deflect blame and maintain the status quo. By focusing attention on false narratives, Western powers can continue to exploit Africa's resources without facing scrutiny or accountability. Meanwhile, the true nature of the exploitation, how African wealth is funneled out of the continent and into the coffers of Western corporations, remains hidden from public view. The manipulation of narratives extends beyond the media and into the realm of international politics. Western governments and international organizations often present themselves as champions of democracy and human rights, all while ignoring the role they play in propping up corrupt regimes and exploiting Africa's resources. This hypocrisy is rarely challenged in mainstream media, which continues to portray Africa as a continent in need of saving by its former colonizers. But Burkina Faso is challenging this narrative. By taking control of its gold exports, the military junta is not only reclaiming its wealth, but also rewriting the story of its country. This is a story of resistance, a nation refusing to be defined by the narratives imposed upon it by outsiders. It's a story that resonates across Africa, where other nations are beginning to question the narratives that have kept them in chains for so long. The challenge for Burkina Faso and other African nations is to create their own narratives, ones that reflect their reality and aspirations. This is not just about telling a different story. It is about reclaiming control over their destinies. By challenging the narratives imposed upon them by the West, African nations can begin to assert their sovereignty and take control of their future. But this will not be easy. The Western media and political establishment have a vested interest in maintaining their control over the narrative. They will continue to portray Africa in a negative light, using their considerable resources to drown out alternative voices. However, as Burkina Faso's actions demonstrate, it is possible to challenge these narratives and create a new story for Africa, one that is written by Africans themselves and reflects the continent's true potential and strength. One of empowerment, sovereignty, and self-determination. Can Burkina Faso's actions spark a larger movement across Africa? The answer lies in the growing sentiment across the continent against neocolonial exploitation. Burkina Faso is not alone in its struggle to reclaim control over its resources. Across Africa, there is a rising tide of resistance against the Western powers that have long exploited the continent's wealth while leaving its people in poverty. In the Sahel region, where Burkina Faso is located, other nations are also taking steps to assert their sovereignty. Military leaders in countries like Mali and Niger have similarly expressed their dissatisfaction with the current global order, where African resources are exploited for the benefit of others. These leaders are not just making empty statements, they are taking concrete actions to reclaim control over their country's futures. This shift is not just about gold or other resources. It is about a broader movement towards self-determination and sovereignty. For too long, African nations have been forced to play by the rules set by their former colonizers. But now they are beginning to write their own rules to define their futures. This is a powerful and transformative shift, one that could reshape the entire continent. In the years to come, the actions of Burkina Faso could resonate across Africa, inspiring other nations to take similar steps to protect their resources and assert their sovereignty. For example, in Mali, the government has begun nationalizing its gold mining industry, aiming to reduce the influence of foreign corporations and ensure that more of the wealth generated by the country's resources remains within its borders. This move marks a significant shift towards economic self-determination and could pave the way for increased national revenue and development. Similarly, in Niger, the government has taken steps to regain control over its uranium resources, which have long been exploited by French corporations. By renegotiating contracts and asserting greater control over its resources, Niger is challenging the established norms and striving to secure a greater share of the benefits from its natural wealth. These actions are part of a broader trend across Africa where nations are increasingly challenging the neocolonial structures that have perpetuated their underdevelopment. From the nationalization of resources to greater control over economic policies, African nations are beginning to take control of their destinies. This movement represents a powerful shift in the continent's economic and political landscape. However, this shift is not without its challenges. The question now is whether Africa is prepared to withstand the pressure from Western powers and continue on its path towards sovereignty. The answer will depend on the willingness of African nations to stand together in the face of Western resistance. Burkina Faso's actions have set a powerful precedent, but achieving lasting change will require support and solidarity from other African nations. This is a moment of opportunity for Africa, a chance to break free from the chains of neocolonialism and forge a new path forward. The challenge for the continent will be to build a united front against the forces of neocolonialism, which will require not only political will, but also economic cooperation and solidarity. African nations must work together to develop their economies, reduce their dependence on foreign aid and investment, and create a new economic order that benefits the people of Africa rather than foreign powers. This is a daunting task, but it is one that Africa is increasingly prepared to undertake. The actions of Burkina Faso and other nations in the Sahel are just the beginning of a larger movement towards sovereignty and self-determination. The question now is whether Africa can sustain this momentum and build a new future for itself free from the exploitation and control of foreign powers. What does the future hold for Burkina Faso and the broader African continent? The answer is uncertain, but one thing is clear: the status quo is being challenged like never before. Burkina Faso's decision to suspend gold exports is just the beginning of a larger struggle for control over Africa's resources. This struggle will not be easy and will likely face fierce resistance from the West, which has a vested interest in maintaining its control over the continent. However, the actions of Burkina Faso and other African nations suggest that a new era is dawning in Africa. This is an era where African nations are no longer willing to be passive participants in their exploitation. Instead, they are taking control of their resources, asserting their sovereignty, and demanding a fair share of the wealth generated by their natural resources. The future of Burkina Faso will depend on the ability of its leaders to navigate the challenges that lie ahead. This will require not only political will, but also economic and diplomatic acumen. The nation must find ways to develop its economy without relying on the exploitation of its resources by foreign powers. This will require investment in infrastructure, education, and healthcare, as well as the development of a strong and independent private sector. The international community will also play a crucial role in determining the future of Burkina Faso. The West, with its entrenched interest in Africa, is unlikely to relinquish its control without a fight. Economic sanctions, political pressure, and even military intervention are all tools that Western powers have used in the past to maintain their dominance over African resources. The question now is whether Africa is prepared to withstand this pressure and continue on its path towards sovereignty. The actions of Burkina Faso and other nations in the Sahel are just the beginning of a larger movement towards sovereignty and self-determination. The challenge is whether Africa can sustain this momentum and build a new future for itself, free from exploitation and foreign control. The stakes are high, but the potential rewards are immense. If African nations can successfully reclaim control over their resources and assert their sovereignty, they have the potential to transform the continent and create a new future for their people. This is a moment of opportunity for Africa, a chance to break free from the chains of neocolonialism and forge a new path forward. The road ahead will be difficult, but the potential rewards are significant. Africa's time has come, and the world must take notice. Do you think Burkina Faso's decision to suspend gold exports is a good move? Will it improve Africa's economy? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section. Is trading with nations like China and Russia a better option? Want to see more on this topic?